One quarter the wind carried red dust across the lonely plains of Texas in the autumn of 1882, swallowing wagon tracks almost as quickly as they appeared. Travelers hurried through the fading daylight, but one rider remained unbothered by the empty road ahead. Nathan Halle had spent most of his 37 years speaking more to horses than to people. His ranch sat miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by endless grasslands and weathered fences that had become his only companions after losing everyone he had ever called family. He had come to Dry Creek that morning for a new workhorse and nothing more. By sunset, fate had different plans. Near the edge of the livestock yard, a restless crowd circled around an old wooden wagon where an angry rancher shouted at anyone willing to listen. Beside him stood a young woman with tangled brown hair, a patched gray dress, and tired eyes that refused to meet the faces staring back at her. She held a small cloth bundle close to her chest and remained perfectly still while insults flew through the air. "She's useless," the rancher growled. "Doesn't speak, barely reacts, and she's nothing but another mouth to feed. Take her with the mule if you want a bargain." Laughter echoed through the market, but Nathan noticed something no one else seemed to see. While everyone mocked her, the young woman quietly reached down to calm a frightened dog hiding beneath the wagon. The trembling animal relaxed the instant her fingers touched its neck. Nathan frowned. Fear usually spread among frightened creatures, yet somehow she carried peace instead. He stepped closer. "What's her name?" he asked. The rancher shrugged carelessly. "Clara, don't matter much." Nathan looked into the young woman's eyes. They were filled with exhaustion but not defeat. She carried herself with quiet dignity despite everything around her. Without another word, Nathan counted several silver coins into the rancher's rough hands. "The mule stays," he said calmly. "She comes with me." The crowd laughed again, but Nathan ignored every voice. He untied the rope from Clara's wrist and tossed it onto the dirt. For the first time that day, the young woman looked directly at him. She said nothing, only gave a small, grateful nod before climbing into the back of his wagon. As the town disappeared behind them, neither spoke. The silence between them felt different from the noisy cruelty they had left behind. When darkness settled over the prairie, Nathan stopped beside a creek to water the horses. Clara carefully unpacked a small loaf of bread from her bundle and broke it into 3 pieces. One for Nathan, one for herself, and the smallest for a hungry stray dog that had quietly followed the wagon all afternoon. Nathan smiled without realizing it. "You always notice the forgotten ones, don't you?" She simply lowered her eyes and continued feeding the animal. Long after midnight, they reached Cedar Hollow Ranch. The house was simple, built from rough timber with a stone chimney and wide porch facing endless fields. Nathan unlocked the front door and lit an oil lamp. Clara slowly walked through the cabin, studying every corner before placing her tiny bundle beside the fireplace. She seemed relieved more than surprised. The next morning, Nathan left before sunrise to repair broken fencing. When he returned several hours later, the ranch looked strangely different. The horses had been brushed. Fresh water filled every trough. Firewood had been stacked neatly beside the porch, and smoke drifted peacefully from the chimney. Inside, warm stew simmered over the fire. Clara stood near the window arranging dried herbs she had gathered from the hills. Nathan had never shown her where anything belonged, yet somehow everything had found its proper place. Days passed quietly. Nathan discovered that Clara communicated through simple sketches and short notes written with charcoal on smooth pieces of wood. She rarely wrote more than a sentence, but every word carried meaning. One morning, she left a message beside his coffee cup. "Move the cattle before sunset." Nathan glanced outside. The sky was perfectly clear. There was not a single cloud in sight. Still, something about her calm expression convinced him to listen. By afternoon, he had moved the herd into the lower pasture. Just before nightfall, a violent windstorm crashed across the hills, ripping through the upper grazing fields and knocking ancient trees onto the old fence line. Had the cattle remained there, many would have been crushed or scattered for miles. Nathan stared across the wrecked pasture before turning toward Clara. She stood quietly on the porch watching the storm as though she had expected every gust. Later that evening, he wrote a question on a wooden board. "How did you know?" Clara looked at the words for several seconds before gently erasing them with her sleeve. Instead of answering, she drew the shape of a bird flying ahead of dark clouds. Beneath it, she added only 3 words. "Nature always whispers." Nathan read the sentence again and again. Perhaps she simply noticed things others ignored. Perhaps years of surviving hardship had sharpened her instincts beyond ordinary understanding. Whatever the reason, he found himself trusting her without needing an explanation. As winter slowly approached, Cedar Hollow Ranch no longer felt like an empty place haunted by old memories. The silence that once weighed heavily on Nathan's heart had become peaceful, shared with someone who understood that not every truth needed to be spoken aloud. Neither of them noticed the stranger watching the ranch from a distant ridge through a brass spyglass, his horse hidden among the cedar trees. He turned away with a cold smile before disappearing into the gathering dusk, carrying secrets that would soon change both of their lives. The first snow melted beneath a pale winter sun as Nathan stepped outside before dawn. The distant hills looked peaceful, yet something about the silence felt different. Fresh hoofprints crossed the northern pasture, stopping just beyond the broken fence before disappearing into the cedar trees. Someone had visited the ranch during the night. Nathan tightened his coat and followed the trail, but it vanished where the frozen ground turned to rock. When he returned, Clara was waiting on the porch holding a small leather pouch she had found near the barn. Inside rested an old silver pocket watch engraved with the initials E.B. Nathan had never seen it before. Whoever had dropped it had been close enough to watch the cabin without being noticed. Over the following days, strange things continued to happen. A gate would be left open, tools were quietly moved, and someone seemed to be riding along the ridge after sunset. Nathan refused to leave Clara alone for long. She remained calm, but her eyes often wandered toward the northern hills as though she sensed they were no longer alone. One cold afternoon, they rode into Dry Creek for supplies. As soon as they entered town, whispers followed them once again. Some people still remembered the quiet young woman who rarely spoke, but this time the rumors were different. An elderly shopkeeper approached Nathan and studied Clara carefully before asking, "Where did you find her?" Nathan answered honestly. The old man's expression changed. Years ago, a family disappeared from the Eastern Valley after a gang of land thieves burned their ranch. They had a little girl named Clara. Folks believed no one survived. Nathan looked at Clara, who lowered her eyes after hearing her own name. She slowly reached into her pocket and unfolded a faded piece of cloth embroidered with the same initials carved into the pocket watch. E.B. For the first time, pieces of the mystery began fitting together. That evening, after returning home, Clara unlocked an old memory she had carried in silence for years. Using charcoal and several wooden boards, she carefully drew pictures instead of writing long sentences. She sketched a burning house, frightened horses running through smoke, a kind woman placing the silver watch into a little girl's hands, and a tall man with a scar across his left cheek leading armed riders away into the darkness. Nathan understood enough. Clara had not been abandoned. She had survived. Someone had stolen everything from her family. 2 nights later, the stranger finally came. 3 riders stopped outside the ranch just after midnight. The leader stepped forward, his face marked by a long scar stretching from his temple to his jaw. Nathan recognized him immediately from Clara's drawing. "Hand over the girl," the man demanded. "She saw something years ago that belongs buried." Nathan rested one hand on the porch rail. "She belongs to no one." The outlaw smiled coldly before signaling his men to move forward. At that moment, Clara stepped outside carrying the silver pocket watch. She held it high where the moonlight reflected from its polished surface. The scarred man's confidence disappeared. Nathan suddenly understood. The watch was more than a keepsake. Hidden beneath its back cover was a folded land deed proving Clara's parents legally owned thousands of valuable acres before they were murdered. The gang had spent years searching for the document, fearing the truth would one day destroy the fortune they had stolen. When the outlaws charged, Nathan stood his ground. Years of ranch work had made him strong, and every inch of the property was familiar to him. Horses scattered, lanterns shattered, and the frozen yard erupted into chaos. Clara quietly released the ranch dogs from their enclosure. The loyal animals rushed toward the attackers, forcing 2 riders from their saddles. Hearing the commotion, neighboring ranchers who respected Nathan came racing across the fields with lanterns and rifles. Outnumbered and trapped, the gang surrendered before sunrise. Within weeks, the county court confirmed the truth hidden inside the silver watch. Clara was declared the rightful heir to her family's land, and the men responsible for stealing it were sentenced for murder, fraud, and robbery. When spring returned to Texas, wildflowers covered the hills around Cedar Hollow Ranch. Nathan rebuilt the old fences, while Clara planted fruit trees beside the cabin. The ranch no longer felt like a refuge from loneliness. It had become a home built on trust instead of fear. One evening, Nathan carved a wooden sign and placed it beside the front gate. Clara smiled as she carefully painted the final letters beneath it. Every soul deserves a place where kindness speaks louder than words. Travelers who passed the ranch often stopped to rest, sharing meals around the fire and listening to Nathan's stories, while Clara welcomed every stranger with quiet warmth. Children loved the gentle horses she trained, and injured animals somehow always found their way to her hands. Years later, people across Texas would tell stories about the silent woman whose compassion healed broken hearts and frightened creatures alike, and about the lonely rancher who discovered that the strongest bond in life is not built through endless conversation but through loyalty, patience, and trust. And every storyteller who visited Cedar Hollow ended the tale the same way. Some voices are heard with the ears, but the truest ones are heard with the heart. Thank you for listening to this original story from Saddle Stories. Tales where every trail leads to a new adventure and every ending leaves behind a lesson worth remembering.